Okay, so we're going to talk about Moody Adams' article, Moral Progress and Human Agency. Um, and she's going to reference some people, some other common thinkers like Peter Singer, Martha Nussbaum, who sort of talk about moral progress as this idea of the ability to sort of like expand your circle of moral concern. So Peter Singer, for example, is going to say it's a natural progression to say, okay, I care about people, and then maybe I care about my family. How can I expand that? I care about my community at large. Maybe then I care about all people, and then maybe then I'm gonna think I should care about animals too. I should care about treat animals as morally relevant agents. And so that is sort of like a way that people have kind of mapped out some ways that moral progress, as sort of defined as expanding arenas of moral concern, can occur. But Moody Adams in this article is going to offer some different ways of thinking about moral progress. And she's also going to respond to a critic of moral progress, Christopher Lasch, who was a historian, and she sort of opens by talking about him. And he argues that belief in moral progress, or sort of endorsing moral progress, is unrealistic. And he says that this is because the idea of sort of continued progress we can't really achieve, because he says we have sort of built-in cultural and psychological limits that don't allow us to just sort of endlessly expand our area of moral concern. Just like we can't have endless economic growth because we have just like natural resource limitations in place. So his main points, as sort of Moody Adams takes it, is that we don't have the emotional capacity to be invested in that many people. And she also says there's this idea that having sustained moral progress, in which more individuals are treated as objects of moral concern, might also mean widening access to certain economic goods. So this other point about not being able to have endless economic growth is kind of also related in some ways to his critique of moral progress. And she says these are valid concerns that we need to kind of think about when we're thinking about the importance of moral progress, or even the possibility of moral progress, and whether it can kind of be a way to sort of view history, and also to sort of think about what the use of it might be. And so she offers, so her aim is sort of to say that moral progress is compatible with accepting certain limits, and also she kind of offers several different definitions of what moral progress can look like, and then fleshes out several dimensions of moral progress as a concept. And so her first point is that moral progress is important from a moral psychology standpoint. So she says it can kind of have this regulative effect on our concerns, and she says that there's this big importance of hope when thinking about making various changes happen. And so she calls hope a state of quote unquote expectant desire. And so it combines wanting something to happen, desiring a certain outcome, with the idea that that outcome is possible. So it's different than just wishing, which is kind of like thinking, maybe it's not possible, but I really wish, my parents would take me to Disneyland, even though they said it's not possible and blah, blah, blah. So it's a different, or I really wish a genie would come and grant me, endless wealth and whatever. So hope is different because it's this idea that the outcome that you're desiring is possible. And so she says this is a really important motivational aspect of moral progress, the idea that sort of this kind of progress is possible. And she says hope is also not enough, and participants in major social movements also require courage, so taking on real risks. And so she says these are things like hope and courage are really important sort of affective results of believing in something like moral progress. And so your belief in the ability to achieve moral progress is going to then motivate you to actually work on the social changes that you're concerned with. And so she then talks about some of the mechanisms of moral progress. So, how is moral progress achieved and kind of what is it? And she says one of the ways that moral progress is achieved is through what she calls something like conceptual expansion. And so this is kind of using enriching, it's a sort of linguistic innovations. And it's kind of using enriching descriptive languages. So maybe coming up with new concepts to describe the world around us in a way that then is attending to concerns for things like justice. So one example that she uses is this concept of sexual harassment, which wasn't a term before, I believe, the 70s, possibly the 60s, but the term sexual harassment just didn't exist. And so when often it was women in the workplace who had sort of maybe recently entered the workforce were being subject to a lot of what we now call sexual harassment, they just didn't have the language for that. So you might just say, he's flirting with me in a way that makes me uncomfortable, but it's just flirting. And so they didn't even have the language to describe what was going on and why it was unjust. And then this term sexual harassment came about and sort of widened the conceptual landscape for understanding that kind of injustice. So that's one way that moral progress is achieved. Another way she talks about moral progress being achieved is through expanding what she calls the perceptual space in which moral agents exist. And so this means not just introducing new concepts, but changing how people perceive their space in the world and their relation to others. So this might be achieved through education or engagement with different resources. It might also be achieved through engagement with different kinds of art, certain novels, etc. And so certain imaginative exercises that function to sort of build empathy, maybe put you in different perspectives that you might not normally be a part of, and then through that, changing how you perceive your relation to others in the world, how you perceive your sort of responsibilities in terms of what you owe other people socially. And so that can be another way of, another mechanism through which moral progress is achieved. Of course, those aren't the only ways. And she talks a lot about sort of the complexity of moral progress, which I think is an interesting point. I think is kind of a unique point that she offers, because she says we shouldn't expect just permanent, broad-based moral progress after we've achieved a sort of success in terms of changing a social movement. And so she says that there are cases in which maybe making moral progress in one area can cause moral regress in another area. So maybe including a certain kind of group might then result in the exclusion of another kind of group, and there might be unforeseen consequences to our attempts at moral progress. And there are also cases in which what appears to be moral progress at a given time then later on appears to be morally regressive. And so one example of this might be the military policy of don't ask, don't tell, which at the time when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was implemented, it was thought to be very progressive because it allowed gay people to be in the military as long as they just didn't say that they were gay, as long as they didn't talk about it. But there was a new rule that at least you couldn't ask formally. But, it was also that you couldn't disclose your sexual orientation. And so later, I think it was Obama who got rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and basically sort of set a new norm of at least allowing on paper people to be out as gay in the military, which was sort of a new thing. And so that might be a case in which what appears to be morally progressive at one time, or what might actually be morally progressive given the social context of a certain time period, then later as the social context changes, might appear to be regressive. And so I think the point from Moody Adams is that it is not, you're not going to achieve static wins. It's going to be an ongoing effort. So moral progress is something that must be continually fought for and continually achieved. And she talks about it being something that is locally achieved, meaning you're not just going to have all areas of moral concern all progress at once. It's going to be more of smaller areas of moral progress in sort of limited cultures, and you try to sort of build on those achievements. So keep some of these points in mind when we're talking about the next essay, which is from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who also talks about this idea that moral progress needs to be actively fought for and engaged with.